This episode of Radio Free 501c is supported by USAE News, the weekly paper of the association industry. It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp, and we're so excited to be back for Season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. He's back already. It's Pete Sepp of the National Taxpayers Union. He's here helping us out when our original guest had to cancel. We hope they're doing okay. Our topic this week's a great one. You're going to love it. Artificial intelligence and government regulation. We want to thank USAE News for their support of this episode. Check them out at their website, usaenews.com. It's October 21, 2024. Welcome to episode 259. Hey everybody, it's Monday, October 21st. That means it's time for another episode of Radio Free 501c, brought to you by Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you haven't already followed us or subscribed on your favorite podcast service, please take a moment and do that so you don't miss any future episodes. And to our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may happen to be. And thanks again for joining us. This week, he's back already. He was just here a couple weeks ago, Pete Sepp of the National Taxpayers Union. He filled in at the last minute during a guest cancellation crisis we were having here at Radio Free 501c. So we want to thank Pete for coming back so quickly and helping us out with our episode. Our topic today is artificial intelligence and government regulation. Pete loves to talk regulation because that's part of what he does at work. So Pete, welcome back. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about yourself?
Well, greetings again, everyone. Like a bad penny, I keep coming back. I'm president of National Taxpayers Union, a 55-year-old citizen-based taxpayer advocacy group that works for fairer, lower, less burdensome taxes, better government budgeting, less burdensome regulation, and economic freedom at all levels of government. We describe ourselves as fiscal conservatives, but not necessarily political conservatives. And there's a whole lot to unpack when it comes to artificial intelligence, as you very well know, Cecilia.
Yes. I have blogged about it several times over the years, and I have a lot of opinions about it. But when it comes to government regulation, that's an issue that I think is always important to discuss, not just for artificial intelligence, but for any technology, because governments tend not to catch up with technology. It gets out of the barn, so to speak, before we can shut the door. And takes off, and a lot of bad things tend to happen before the government can catch up and regulate. Unfortunately, what ends up happening a lot of times is it ends up over-regulating or becoming draconian. But before we dive into that, I know there's an international aspect of this topic we're going to cover, but doesn't NTU do some international work as well on issues of tax and spending policy?
Oh, indeed we do. We were a founding organization along with about a dozen others from around the world in the World Taxpayers Associations. That was initially formed in 1988. You might remember the opening gala that you and I attended for that event. It now has more than 50 member organizations across the world, ranging from Japan, the Philippines, China, Germany, France, UK. We have groups in South America and Africa as well, all dedicated to improving the rights of taxpayers. And here with artificial intelligence, we often talk about how governments can regulate its use in the private economy. But my philosophy is, physician, heal thyself first. Governments have to learn how to use artificial intelligence correctly themselves before they start regulating how others are going to use it. Or at the very least, they need to catch up with the regulations they're proposing for the rest of us and apply it to what they're doing. I tell you, I have a lot of experience in one area with AI, and that is its use in tax enforcement and taxpayer services. Two very different applications for AI. One might be helpful, the other could be very, very dangerous. Guess which one is which?
Well, I'll let you clarify that for the audience. Before we let you answer that question, though, Radio Free 501c would like to thank USAE News, the weekly newspaper covering the association industry, focusing on CVBs, annual conferences, and other events. Thank you, USAE News, for supporting this episode. You can learn more about USAE News by visiting their website, usaenews.com. And I know this is probably a topic they might cover in their news in the future because they cover a little bit of everything. So let's get back to your statement, Pete, artificial intelligence and the IRS and tax policy. So which one do you think would be useful for citizens and taxpayers?
Potentially useful applications of AI could occur in the so-called customer service area of the IRS. We have to remember here that the Internal Revenue Service is, in my opinion, the most technologically challenged federal agency in the entire government. Some folks may quibble with that assessment, but the Government Accountability Office, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, others will say that if it isn't the most challenged technologically, the IRS is one of the most challenged. Do you know that the individual master file, the infrastructure that is supposed to undergird all of the IRS's data for tax filers, has components that are older than either of us, 64 years old? Now, that is apparently the oldest legacy system in the entire federal government, and attempts to reform the individual master file and other parts of the IRS's technological architecture have been going on since the 1970s, and they've been failing since the 1970s. Here's hoping that the recent infusion of funding the IRS received from the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 can help to address it, but that is far from a settled conclusion right now. Unfortunately, a lot of the money was thrown at enforcement and compliance without much thought given as to how it would be spent. And to my mind, updating the IRS's technology would be the way to serve the goals of customer service, enforcement, compliance, almost anything. If the IRS can't get technology right, it really can't get much else right. And artificial intelligence here can play a role. There was a recent webinar from the Tax Policy Center. It was entitled, Can Machine Learning Improve Tax Enforcement? The IRS has already launched a multi-year machine learning experiment for detecting non-compliance. Now, that's not quite like the evolving AI we're seeing now, but the problem is the next generation that goes beyond this 5-year machine learning experiment already has some hallmarks of potential failure. One participant from the Brookings Institution said, well, it's good that the IRS is pursuing this kind of technology, but it needs to be carefully monitored, because what happens if certain taxpayers are identified for examination or enforcement without the ability to interact with a human being, an examination officer? That could set up severe taxpayer rights challenges. And on the customer service side, what if, frankly, the AI service representative is wrong? What happens if a taxpayer relies on that advice going forward and has no one to complain to? This is a very real problem, because my organization lobbied a good 35 years ago now for a simple taxpayer rights fix that says if you get advice from the IRS about a particular tax question in writing, and you rely on that advice, and the IRS comes back to you and says, "Nuh-uh, you're wrong," you are absolved of penalties and interest on anything going forward that is associated with that written advice. Well, what is advice that's given through AI? Is that the written advice that's covered by the taxpayer rights statute or not? It's unclear right now.
Well, what's unclear to me is I thought this was supposed to be what might be beneficial. It sounds like this is not beneficial at all.
Well,
And I would think that if we have a government agency like the IRS with such outdated technology, it doesn't seem apparent to me that there is an easy way for them to start applying artificial intelligence, because that requires a very advanced operating system. It requires a lot of computer memory. It also requires savvy in order to be able to use these tools, because artificial intelligence needs to be trained and managed, and you can't just let it loose to do things. I think it's one of the problems with chatbots is people call them AI. They're really not, because they tend to be attached to very poorly updated data systems,
yes.
Which is why you get really stupid answers. So I would think, considering the fact that even if you do talk to a human being at the IRS, it's 70% of the time they're not correct with the information. That 70% incorrect, if they're the people we're relying on to program the AI, I would think that would be a problem.
Well, some of the information is incorrect. Of course, the IRS defines level of service in a very strange way, claiming they answer their phones anywhere between 70 to 90% of the time. We found out and passed this along to Congress that they're not really measuring it that way. They don't measure hangups. They don't measure questions that are so-called out of scope. In other words, the operators can't answer them, so on and so on and so on. This is the way governments often work. They use terms that all the rest of us do, but they don't really mean what all the rest of us take to mean. And
especially so, at the IRS, I think they like to use their own language to keep us confused.
Yes, and so you make a good point about AI. There are pockets of the IRS that are technologically advanced and can support certain AI functions, but you have to learn to walk before you can run. And when it comes to the overall technology architecture, I don't even know if they're at walking stage yet, more like crawling.
You know, that's pretty funny, because now I'm starting to wonder, is the master file in COBOL?
Yes.
Or DOS? It's COBOL? Oh my gosh.
Parts of it are, not all, but parts.
Wow.
You rely on a COBOL platform. And this may be apocryphal, but I have heard, and I want to check this out, that the service has had to look abroad in places like Eastern European countries where there might be former intelligence officers who knew COBOL when they were spying on us during the Cold War.
Maybe they can decipher our tax system while they're at it. That would be helpful. So one of the things about AI, though, and I know tax policy is your specialty, but we did want to talk about government regulation, and a big area of government regulation is tax policy. And the IRS, I think most of us, anyway, I'm not going to say we all know this. I think most of us know they are probably the most challenged with customer service, technology, and just making sure they get their work done in a timely manner. Those of us who follow the news know they got really far behind during the lockdown on reviewing tax returns. And a lot of people had to wait a really long time to get their tax refund, or to find out that their tax form was even received and their payment was received. And that's the kind of automation that artificial intelligence can help with. But many of us in the real world, and I say real world because I mean outside of government service, because they operate very differently than the rest of the for-profit world and the nonprofit world. Those of us who are keeping up with AI, who are using it, or who are questioning its use. I do use it to a certain extent, but I do not use it for generative issues. I do not use it to pretend to be me. For example, I don't let it take my notes. I take my own notes. There's a lot of AI tools out there being released very quickly. A personal example is I host a monthly networking call for nonprofit management consultants. And, sometimes I have to kick out AI note takers because they're attached to a person's calendar. And if they don't remember to turn it off for that calendar appointment, it just shows up if that person's there or not. I also was on a focus group last week where somebody's AI showed up to take notes, and the facilitator said, well, it was the person who actually had the contract for the focus groups. They didn't come, but they sent their AI note taker. You really can't do anything about that unless you're running the meeting. You have to accept the fact that these things are here. If you want them there or not. So this is where government regulation starts to come into play. I know the European Union has made a lot of regulations. They seem to be much better at keeping up with technology and society than other governments in the rest of the world. But what are some differences that you have seen between US regulation for AI technology and the European Union's AI technology regulation?
Well, there are actually a number of different regulatory approaches, UK, of course, Japan, Switzerland, and the really degrees of flexibility are often differentiators. Right now, there's this desire to pass some premature, comprehensive governance statute, get a law in place that applies to all types of AI, the underlying technology, and try to get some global fix here that would throw a giant regulatory framework on how it all evolves. That to us would seem to be a mistake. It's tempting to worry about the underlying technology of AI and ignore the applications of AI. And that was one of the recommendations that one of my colleagues, who is our director of technology and senior policy fellow, Ryan Nabil, he made the recommendation that the US needs to regulate the applications of AI rather than AI's technological framework or infrastructure. And I think that's an important differentiation. When you say, well, the IRS can't use AI at all. No, there are areas where it could help. Maybe what you say is the IRS cannot use AI for enforcement in what is called collection due process after the audit is over and the enforcement begins with liens and levies. Keep that particular application out of that process because things could go very nasty for the rights of taxpayers very quickly. You look at right now the Biden administration wanting to invoke the Defense Production Act. That's a law that basically allows the federal government to commandeer private sector production resources in the event of a national emergency. In the case of COVID, you could have invoked it to make more masks, for example. That was the controversy back then. Should President Trump have done that to speed up the production of COVID remedies and responses? Well, the Biden administration wants to invoke it for AI and say that AI developers have to share their data, their codes, their testing with the federal government and let the federal government decide whether the technology should be allowed to proceed. Well, I'm not sure that that's the right way to go. Highly intrusive, highly detrimental to the innovation that could occur through AI. Maybe what you say is, all right, once you've done your testing, once you have your data, once you come out with the application, maybe there's some kind of review process.
Well, and that also sounds like a controlled economy, which is a throwback to 1930s socialist dictatorship economies. We have a presidential candidate talking about price controls, and we know how well those all work, don't we? So if the government gets involved in overseeing the development of any technology, I think we're going to have a problem. And if we're looking at government regulation, our example this week is artificial intelligence, but if we expand that out into government regulation in other areas of products and service development, look at the failure of the Food and Drug Administration with medical devices. They take 10 years to approve a pill, but they'll let somebody stick a piece of metal in you in 5 weeks. And there's not a lot of follow up on that. There's people are sticking things everywhere, but you can't create a new medicine in a timely manner, which is why the initial COVID vaccine development was so amazing, because that was done in like 6 months instead of 5 years, which is the usual thing for medication. So there's a lot of government regulation that could be cleaned up and streamlined. But I do not believe that the government should get in the way of that development. I think what they need to do, and this was what along the lines of what you've already said, is the application of that technology. How is that technology used, and how is it controlled? And when we live in a world where everything's about data, your personal data, your business data, that's the trade. That's what's going on. I recently had Brian Scott on the show. He's an IT consultant and expert, talking about the corporatization of the dark web and hacking services, basically. So they've become so sophisticated with stealing your data that they actually are now farming it out to other people. So like a whole corporate industry on the dark web has formed. And I think when you're looking at artificial intelligence, a lot of those hackers are using AI in a bad way. And I would hope the government would look at that. We have several people out there, several big companies, like OpenAI, you have Elon Musk company, they're all working on AI. And I think when we're looking at these regulations about the end use of the tool, it's like cars. So a lot of car companies exist in the world, and the US government regulates how safe those cars are. So they're not getting in the way of you developing the car, but they're telling you that car better be safe for the end user. And I think if we take that approach to AI, go ahead and create your AI. There's a lot out there. There's Gemini, Google Gemini. There's Open AI's Chat GPT, and then there's Copilot from Microsoft, or the big three I think most people talk about and know about. But what we need to know is that data is going to be safe. One of the other issues with generative AI is it's basically scraping the internet, and it's violating all kinds of IP and copyright laws by doing that. But then companies like OpenAI are trying to say, oh no, it's not a problem. Well, actually it is. This is why Google was stopped from publishing every single book ever written for no fee. They were trying to do that 25 years ago, and they were not allowed to do that. So I think with the government regulation of AI, we have a lot of other different laws we have to consider, and a lot of other areas that need to be examined, because this thing's going fast. It's growing exponentially, because AI does not have distractions like the human mind. And so we need to really start putting up some of these guardrails.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not completely without those guardrails. Here's a plug, a word of praise for what government has been doing. Imagine that coming from me.
From you especially.
there is plenty to go around. Let's not always be critical of everything government does. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology has come up with a risk management framework for federal agencies to try and follow. And the Office of Management and Budget has been directing agencies on how to do some of this implementation. It's been uneven. The IRS issued one for implementing the framework. That must have been in the spring of this year. And it's good to see in there that the service is recognizing that taxpayer rights and the provisions of laws that we enacted and helped to enact over the years, that has to be taken into account when implementing AI, but there are still many challenges and some congressional guidance that would demand that certain benchmarks be met among federal agencies. That would be a good thing. And in fact, there's legislation called the Federal AI Risk Management Act that could help speed those things along. Agencies will complain about timetables and specifics. Okay, fine, but let's start that dialogue. Let's make sure Congress is involved, and let's proceed methodically. There are other ways too that could encourage collaboration between not only Congress and the public, but regulators and the regulated. And here I'm speaking about regulatory sandboxes.
Well, I think for the audience, could you explain what you mean by a regulatory sandbox?
Yeah. A regulatory sandbox is, as its name would kind of imply, a place where innovators, those affected by potential government regulations, can play around with their products and how they might interact with government regulations in an environment that is less threatening than, say, a court or a congressional hearing chamber. It's kind of a shirt sleeve collaborative environment where an innovator might come along and say, hey, I have this service, and I want to allow a portal that would give customer consent to giving up X, Y, and Z of their data, and I want to use it this way. How might this run into your regulatory framework, Mr. Government Official? And how do we design something that allows the product to get out there without it running afoul of what your expectations are? And so these sandboxes were initially devised for financial tech issues, and have been implemented at our own state level in several places. They have been implemented through EU, UK, with varying degrees of success. I mean, one of the keys, I think, that makes a good regulatory sandbox is that non-threatening environment, the promise that we're all working toward less burdensome regulation that is still effective, rather than simply scouting out the next thing that has to be heavily regulated. If both regulators and innovators approach the sandbox in good faith, knowing what the purpose is, they can work pretty well.
Well, that actually sounds like a really great idea, and I'd like to see that happen more at the U.S. government in a lot of different areas. That's very much kind of the mindset of Silicon Valley. At least it used to be when Silicon Valley was first forming. That whole idea of exploration and idea sharing and testing and building on each other's ideas is a great way to do it. And bringing it back to our topic of government regulation and artificial intelligence, I had mentioned the European Union. You then mentioned the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Japan. What do you like about what they're doing with artificial intelligence regulation?
Well, I think many of the AI regulatory approaches abroad recognize the fact, as we began earlier on the program, that governments have to essentially embrace the rules that they're expecting others to live by. And that isn't the case with every one of them, but many of them do recognize that fact. And our own government, it kind of runs hot and cold. You have the NIST framework. On the other hand, you have attempts to invoke the Defense Production Act. You have IRS's own guidance about how AI is supposed to work internally. But then you have programs using AI in enforcement that are well beyond what Congress thought the IRS was doing. And in fact, in a recent debate over the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill, the one that covers IRS, there was an amendment introduced by a member of Congress to specifically defund any AI application that the IRS was using for enforcement purposes. So that's already become a controversy. I think that there has been a little less of that in the EU and the UK, but we're watching how it unfolds there. I know that my colleague Ryan Nabil pointed out that the EU's encouragement of sandboxes has kind of run into a little trouble. Spain, for example, set some up, and there was a bit of reluctance among the private sector to enter the sandboxes because they didn't feel that the purpose was sufficiently collaborative, that it was designed to effectively spy on the private sector and
Oh, well.
essentially to try and get a regulatory leg up
Mhm.
on what was happening. That's, again, not the purpose. The purpose is not to get a leg up either on the government or on the private sector, but to rather step in with both legs and see how we can build something that's acceptable to everybody.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I could see the private sector being hesitant in any country because if you enter one of these sandboxes with your competitors, I think that would give you pause. That would make you worried that they might steal one of your ideas and build on that and get to market before you do. And so that's another downside of trying to get the private sector in there, unless they're really focused on one specific question at a time. Like,
That's right.
how can we make this report work better? Or what should be in this report? What should not be in this report?
Yeah.
I think that your concerns about AI and enforcement, and I know you've specifically said the IRS, but enforcement applies to a lot of different government agencies that enforce different regulations. I think that using AI for that is a real danger to the rest of us human beings because you can't reason with it. It's sort of like the Terminator. If you've ever seen the Terminator movie, you can't reason with it. It has no compassion. It won't listen. It's just going to focus on what it's doing. And people laughed at some of the concerns from that. You know, the stories that we tell, though, are us warning ourselves about things. They're cautionary tales. Fairy tales for children are cautionary tales about how children can remain safe. So we tell ourselves these stories about different technologies because it's a warning to us to be careful. Yeah. And I think any free society that wants to remain free needs to be careful with something as dangerous.
That's true, and I'm seeing that in a lot of places. We interact with a number of policy communities. For example, those involved in advocacy for affordable housing are at one point encouraged that AI might be able to reduce the biases in so-called redlining of loan programs. On the other, some are saying, well, if the designer of the technology is biased, then garbage in, garbage out. There are those in the national security community, and I'm part of a group called the Pentagon Budget Campaign, whose members are very concerned about letting the Defense Department go wild with AI to the point where they'll plug it into how we run cybersecurity around our nuclear systems.
Oh my gosh, it's Skynet all over again.
Oh, you don't want to overreact, but neither do you want to just dismiss it all.
Right.
And there's also concern among banking regulators utilizing this with a heavy hand, or the Federal Trade Commission designing AI and algorithms that would start worming their way into the entire economy and identifying what the government calls anti-competitive behavior, but might not be at all. And just like the IRS, if the FTC comes after you, you're guilty until proven innocent. It's a very expensive and frightening process, frankly, for not just these giant corporations that are being prevented from merging. The FTC investigates a whole lot of businesses who are not mega corporations.
Well, and when you think about not implementation, the implication for free speech with like the Federal Communication Commission, which is the agency that oversees like broadcast television, cable can just kind of do whatever they want. But what if those rules changed and they used AI to come in and like turn your show off or rewrite your script? This was what the writer strike and the actor strike was about recently. They did not want to be replaced by AI. And frankly, they cannot be in a lot of ways. People who use AI to write always say they have to go back and clean it up. It's never as good as when an actual person does it. But people are becoming lazier, and that's what AI is also promoting, is a little bit of laziness. I'm not going to write it. I'm going to let the AI write it. Well, that's not a good process for human beings. And I do think we need to have a cautionary tale about AI, and whether that's your choice as the Terminator or Mr. Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, who our friend Bruce is always saying they should just turn data off and shut the holodeck down. It's all run by AI and it always causes problems. Right. And I often think about how different the world would be if we had paid attention to the ancient Chinese scientist who accidentally created gunpowder, because that person wrote down, never mix these elements together.
And there
And
you go.
now we have a gun crisis all over the world. It's not just the United States. There's a lot of gun violence going on around the world because people didn't pay attention to the cautionary tale of don't mix these things together.
And it shows up in the most interesting places. This conversation reminded me, my organization has a public interest litigation arm, and I heard some of our attorneys talking about this. In several instances now, in U.S. district courts, even courts of appeals, attorneys have been called out on their legal briefs for citing cases that have been made up by AI. And, the attorneys certainly didn't know about it, or at least they were just careless and saying, oh yeah, this case supports my contention. We'll cite it. And some intern perhaps found it, and they stick it in their brief. And then the judge's clerk or the judge goes to read it, and it doesn't exist. Some
And I have heard these examples, and that's an example of artificial intelligence not being controlled and people being lazy. That's just lazy research. I do sometimes use AI for research. I'll ask it a question and say, can you find some data on how much women make in the real estate industry versus men? But I don't just take it at face value. I then go and double check it. Google Gemini is now starting to add its own citations to show you that actually pulled it from a place that actually had the data. But I've heard these examples of legal cases just being completely fabricated, usually by ChatGPT, because a wild imagination, like a child, just makes things up. But I used to work in a law firm right after I graduated from college, and 98% of what those attorneys did was research. They were going to the books. They were going to case law. They're saying, is there a case that supports my position to help my client? And that's a big part of it. Now, AI automates a lot of things, which is great. But as you said, crap in, crap out. That's the role of any sort of database. If you have bad data, you're going to get bad output. You're going to get bad results. And I think if we're going to use AI to do legal searches, to build case law, then we need to make sure we're using, a good reference like Westlaw or something like that to make sure it's an actual case. But what is fascinating to me, I don't sit around talking to AI. I know some people do. They sort of have conversations with it just to see what it will say. And it will admit, oh, I just made that up.
Yeah.
Like a little kid, or a chronic liar. I just made that up. Well, we need to really be aware of that. And so imagine your example again of the IRS. You're a taxpayer, you're stressed out, and you're talking to an AI bot from the IRS, and it just makes something up.
Yeah,
How are you supposed to know? There's no way to know if it's made up or not.
so just to bring up another positive example, I was recently at the launch of an organization called the Program Integrity Alliance. And program integrity is the shorthand for all of the oversight that's supposed to go into government benefit programs, policing improper payments, and bad systems that generate results that waste money in federal programs. It's bipartisan, cross-ideological, a great organization that I'm going to be very interested in following. They are using AI to develop kind of a big research and analytical platform that will finally allow people to see best practices in real time and results in real time of program integrity initiatives. And for years, all of us in the fiscal policy community have been frustrated by the fact that we have really only anecdotes of what good program oversight can do to save money. It's why the Congressional Budget Office really won't score program integrity in budget bills, because they say there's not enough systematic, projectable evidence as to what types of program integrity yield how much in savings. This alliance and the tools they're developing could finally break through that problem, and AI will help us do it.
Well, and can you say the name of that alliance one more time? And if you know their website, if you could share that.
Yes, fortunately, it's very simple: programintegrity.org.
Oh, excellent. So that'll be easy for the audience to find. So, well, this has been a really great conversation. And I thank you again for fitting this into your schedule at the last minute. It's always a little nerve wracking when you're a podcast host and your guest has something come up that's just unavoidable and they can't come. So thank you again, Pete Sepp, for filling in at the last minute. Really appreciate it. And since you've just recently been on the podcast, I like to ask my guests, what's the one thought that you would like the audience to take away today? And how can they get in touch with you if they would like to learn more?
When it comes to AI, we must not only look to our government to regulate others, but to regulate itself. And doing that is going to take some very cautious and comprehensive policymaking in which all of us must be involved. We have to tread carefully, not fearfully, into this new domain, if you care to use that term. And if people would like to know more about my organization and its work, they can visit us at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. You can probably barely see that on the sign that's over my shoulder.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pete. Always interesting talking to you, and you always have so much to share on a lot of different issues.
My pleasure.
Well, I want to thank Pete again for joining me at the last minute. It's always nice to have a fellow nonprofit management professional living in the same house with you. It makes things a little easier. I also want to thank USAE News for supporting this podcast episode. They are the only weekly newspaper for the association industry, and they cover lots of different news stories with a focus on conventions and events. So check them out at usaenews.com. They have a subscription that fits every budget. So we have to go rogue for now. I want to encourage you again to follow us or subscribe on your favorite podcast service if you haven't already. If you would like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help you bloom outside the box and see the world differently, check out our website, roguetulips.com. If you're interested in continuing education for nonprofit management professionals, check out our education page, roguetulips.com/education. We provide study groups for the CAE exam as well as an ethics course we offer every month. So check that out too. So on behalf of Pete and myself, Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.